coming up.
And so if there is a debate now about which political parties do or do not support Ukraine, when there has been, as you have said, a strong consensus in support of Ukraine, is that kind of considered success by Russia?
I have concerns that we relied on the DOJ to find this out.
This Nazi problem is also of a concern. I am aware that in many debates in Canada,
Move on.
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Okay, so we'd now like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour. As an individual, we have Anton Shekhvtsov, and I apologize for the pronunciation, a visiting professor from Central European University by video conference. We have from Reset, we have Ben Scott, Chief Executive Officer.
Mr. Shekhvtsov, is that correct pronunciation, sir?
Shekhvtsov.
Shekhvtsov, apologies.
Correct. Yes.
How important is it in supporting the fight in Ukraine to present a united front in countries?
Ukraine is heavily Mr. Chair. Ukraine is heavily dependent on external support for its defensive war. What is more important is the unity that Western nations have exhibited since the very beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And although in Europe there are some problematic cases in some member states of the European Union, still Ukraine heavily relies also on the American and Canadian support. And in this case, the consensus, the solidarity of Western nations for Ukraine is crucial. It is existential for Ukraine's fight for its independence and sovereignty today. And of course, Russia or Russian malign actors related to the Kremlin, to the Russian authorities, understand how important this consensus and solidarity are, and they are trying all they can to ruin this solidarity, to create divisions, to create polarization, to create, to undermine that solidarity and support for Ukraine, and hence the information attacks.
Thank you. And so I don't think I'm putting words in your mouth by reiterating what you said, that there is a strong consensus in support of Ukraine in countries like Canada, correct?
This is my understanding, looking at the some data on support that Canada gives to Ukraine, and I mentioned in my speech, I'm really sorry if the audio quality was not enough, but Canada, as far as I know, is in top 10 of the world's donors to Ukraine. So, of course, this is extremely important.
I'm certainly very proud of Canada's long-standing support of Ukraine, especially starting in 2014 with Operation Unifier, training the Ukrainian forces, of which a number of my friends in the Canadian Armed Forces went over there to do that. In a country like Canada, though, sometimes our political debates and partisanship leads to political parties accusing other political parties of not being supportive of Ukraine, including some cases from the Liberal Party where they've accused the Conservative Party of being in the back pocket of Vladimir Putin. Is it helpful for our strong consensus on Ukraine to have the governing political party accuse the opposition party of being, like, how does that help build consensus, or is that bringing down the consensus by creating these divisive debates?
Mr. Chair, I think this is not in my position, or it's not for me to give comments on the political parties competing with each other in Canada. I'm grateful to all the parties in Canada that are providing support for Ukraine, and I would like really not to comment on the political debate.
I understand. I'll kind of put this more generally for you. You talked about how one part of the success of the Russian operation is for the consumption of the disinformation and misinformation that they're spreading. And then the second part is once that has been consumed, when it becomes part of the debate. And so if there is a debate now about which political parties do or do not support Ukraine, when there has been, as you have said, a strong consensus in support of Ukraine, is that kind of considered success by Russia when there's a perception being created that there is no consensus of political support for Ukraine in a country like Canada?
Mr. Chair, I think in this case it is important to highlight that only a full acceptance of a particular malign information narrative produced in Russia can be considered a success, a full success of this malign operation. When there are divisions, when there are some, disinformation narratives spread in the mainstream media, this is only part of success. This is not the only one. I'm sure that, for example, all of you heard that one of the most popular narratives of the Russian propaganda, that Ukrainians are Nazis and Ukraine has a Nazi problem. Just the mere fact that you know about this narrative, it is also part of success, just knowing about this. But it does not mean that the full operation, the entire information operation in Russia has been successful.
That, Canada has a role, like we've sent observers to help out in elections in countries like Ukraine. We see that there are Russian interference in other countries' elections, including the country of Georgia that's upcoming. How concerned are you about Russian influence campaigns in those countries as well, and how do you think Canada can play a role in strengthening those countries' democratic institutions?
Mr. Chair, I am concerned about the developments in Georgia. In September, I published a report on how Russian political warfare also concerns Georgia and what actors in Georgia are essentially amplifying Russian propaganda and disinformation. And the elections that will be held in Georgia later this month, I think that they will be crucial for democracy, not only in Georgia but also, in a way, in this part of the still what is called post-Soviet space.
Thank you, sir.
As far as I know, Canada is also part of the OSCE and participates in the OSCE ODIHR missions, and I hope that Canada will continue participating in those monitoring missions, including Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Shekhvtsov, and I probably got it wrong, but you've written extensively on the influence that Russia had through social media on French President Macron as well as German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Are you seeing that kind of influence here in Canada and our current leadership in the government?
Mr. Chair, I think I should say that Germany and France are the main targets of the Russian operations in Europe, and for North America, it's still the United States of America that is the primary target. So Russia, I can't say that Russia is, going around the West and interfering in all the elections. They do have their limits where they can interfere, where they have resources, where they maybe even have allies to interfere. In some countries, it's very difficult for them. So in a way, Canada is not a priority for the Russian operations, although the fact that so many.
I only have a minute left. On that, though, if we are seeing Russian influence through tenant media on climate change and immigration, for example, and then if you have political parties that have differing views, is that not going to influence Canadians' perceptions of those political parties, given the disinformation that's put out there?
You're absolutely right, of course. All the content that is produced, say, in English language, targeting the West in general, this will necessarily almost automatically have influence on the Canadian audiences. This is something that is impossible to stop, this influence that goes from one audience to another. And also on climate change and, as my colleague said, also on LGBTQI issues and et cetera, and immigration. So although Canada may not be the primary target, still the information operations produced and targeting Western audiences will also target other Western nations, including Canada.
Thank you.
I have concerns that we relied on the DOJ to find this out, whereas you've mentioned we have the capacity in Canada, and yet it seemed from what you were saying that it hasn't been made a priority by our current intelligence and law enforcement agencies. And I did want to ask you a question about that. But before I get to that, I did want to address something with you, Mr. Chair, and register my disappointment that you cancelled Thursday's meeting on this study. I do not feel that we were adequately consulted. The standard practice from my last experience with this before I was away on mat leave was that there was much more consultation with vice chairs, and as first vice chair, I do very much we anticipated that we would be called, discussed of what could be done about Thursday in the event witnesses were not able to attend Thursday committee meeting. Now, that does happen. However, in reviewing the motion put forward by the Liberals, the witnesses mentioned on there was not exhaustive. It specifically mentions other disinformation experts. And I know in past experience, we have had situations where our excellent public servants have come with relatively short notice to provide feedback and information. And of course, this area of study that we're working on has an intelligence focus, it has a law enforcement focus, it has a legal focus. So I would be shocked if all of the individuals in our public service, if any of them could not have come. I do believe that if more effort was put in, we could have had a robust meeting with other witnesses, perhaps within the own government apparatus, which we should include in this study. So I wanted to register my disappointment in that regard, given that we do not feel adequate consultation was provided. I would ask that in the future you provide better consultation. And the second point I wanted to make about this was we have a number of other things as a committee that if we can't get witnesses on this important study, we could have, for example, reviewed the Paul Bernardo report that has been gathering dust. The analysts worked very hard on that report. That was an area of intense public interest when this committee was reviewing it, given that the individual we were talking about was the worst mass killer and rapist in Canadian history, being moved from maximum security prison to medium security prison and all the privileges that entails. I was shocked to see that we wouldn't at least look at that draft report. The committee had already approved to study that issue. We had the draft report. It's sitting and collecting dust. Why is it we were not able to review that report on Thursday? There are a number of studies that we have agreed to as a committee, a number of things we could have talked about. I think it would be shocking to the public to think that a meeting of the Public Safety and National Security Committee should be cancelled because we have nothing to look into. I just find that completely unacceptable, Mr. Chair. And again, in the Liberals' own words, Ms. O'Connell, I wish to discuss this with her, but she's not here at the moment. She did mention that, and I quote her, "We as a committee should be held accountable if we don't take this as a very serious priority. We owe it to Ukrainians to not wait another minute." And yet, where was the discussion, where was the leadership from Liberal members to ensure we had a committee meeting on this on Thursday? There was no one that could, but I find it very hard to believe that, Mr. Chair. So I'd ask that more effort be put into ensuring we have this study. If we can't find witnesses, find someone from government. It is important that we get into this issue. But if we can't, let's focus on the work we've already done. And I would ask if there's no one we can find for a very study, let's look at the Paul Bernardo study. So I wanted to register my very clear disappointment that it was not adequately consulted and that the Public Safety and National Security Committee of Canada failed to have a meeting for an excuse that I don't find acceptable. There are a whole host of issues we could be looking into, and it is a failure that we had that meeting canceled, Mr. Chair. Thank you. With my remaining minute, just on my question, Mr. Scott, again, can you elaborate a little bit on just what you'd said to Ms. Michaud? I thought it was a great area of interest that this committee should hear. I can reiterate if you don't recall what I said.
Certainly,
Yeah.
I do. I don't have any information about what the Canadian authorities did or didn't do or what their involvement might have been in the DOJ indictment. I'm only relying on publicly available documents, including the DOJ's published affidavits. In my experience working in the U.S. government, it is very possible, if not likely, that there was Five Eyes cooperation if this was an intelligence operation that discovered this Russian intervention through signals intelligence. So just because it's not public that the Canadian authorities were involved doesn't mean they weren't. So I can't say one way or the other whether or not they had an involvement in this particular case. What I will say is it's very difficult to detect this kind of operation of payola influence using dark money as a foreign power, because there are so many different YouTube and TikTok channels out there that will operate on a pay-for-play basis. And that, as I read the DOJ affidavits, it was only through wiretaps that they were able to discover this one. And partly I put that at the feet of the technology companies, who simply don't monitor sufficiently for patterns of propagation characteristics that indicate the probability of some kind of malign influence or coordinated inauthentic activity.
Thank you, sir.
The operations launched at European countries how they differ from operations launched to Canada and the United States. So we did mention France and Germany, and I'm just wondering, what is the difference there between what they're doing now to Canada and basically what they've been doing for a number of years to France and Germany? And to Mr. Shekhvtsov, please.
Thank you. Thank you for this question. Indeed, some of the Russian information operations, they target particular audiences, and although there can be the Western world can be one audience, there are still differences between different nations, and those differences, to put it probably simpler, is that every society has its own vulnerabilities and sensitivities, and the vulnerabilities that are probably inherent in one Western society is not really a case for another. Just to give you an example, for France and for Germany, the immigration or even illegal immigration from the Middle East, from Africa, is something that these countries are concerned with. And this is probably not the case for Central European countries, where immigration from those regions of the world is not that significant. For Canada, I think this is the proximity to the US. Maybe some Canadians are not very happy to be, even confused sometimes with the citizens of the United States. This Nazi problem is also of a concern. I am aware that in many debates in Canada,
Move on. Are both far and right political actors equally susceptible, or are they focusing on one over the other?
I think if we are talking about Canada, these are mostly left-wing, mostly far-left actors that are susceptible to Russian disinformation campaigns regarding Ukraine, if we're talking about this. While if the Russian propagandists are talking about immigration, LGBT, then probably it's the far right, the Canadian far right, that is the most susceptible. So different topics, different audiences. Really, those strategic and tactical narratives, they are tailor-made to divide nations, to divide the national consensus. So they're using these extremists from the right and left in order to achieve their objectives.